Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone joining us here, whether you're here with us on Zoom or watching on Facebook. A reminder to those joining us on Zoom, I will send you an invitation to become a panelist. I highly encourage that you take it. It will let you into the room, so to speak, so you can turn on your camera if you wish, which, is always great to see other faces, have it feel more like a real classroom, in-person Beit Midrash experience, and you'll be able to mute and unmute yourself when there are opportunities for participation rather than needing to flag me down. But either way, you'll be able to use the chat here. And if you're joining us on Facebook, you can put questions and comments directly below this video in the comment section. I'll take a peek now and then to make sure that you remain part of the conversation. This class is very special to us. This is a one-time class on priests and poverty with Ms. Isabel Bard, who is an alumna of our high school program for high school girls. Both our programs for high school girls and middle school girls are open for applications right now, as well as we have open applications for Yeshivat Drisha, for Shana Aleph, for those who might be interested in joining the club of alumni. In addition to studying at Drisha, Ms. Bard also studied at the conservative yeshiva and Yeshivat Hadar, and we're very happy to be touching base again and learning with her this time. This class again is on priests and poverty, and I very much look forward. So over to you, Ms. Bard, please.
Thank you very much. I'm so excited to be here. This is personally really, really special to me. As Noah said, I'm returning to the scene of the crime, if you will. Sorry, the crispest memories I have of Torah learning are like getting off this plane that I just like flown across an ocean on my own and like having a madracha come get me and then like walking into a Beit Midrash being like, oh, like this is what it's about, like this is what it's for, and not really being able to leave. So that's a little bit of background. My name is Isabel. I'm from London. It is dark outside right now, and it was a horrible rainy day today. That's kind of a little bit about the space that I'm in. I want to speak to a little of why I kind of put this source sheet together. This is actually something I've had kind of sitting in my back pocket for coming on 2 years now. The like glib answer that I tell people when they're like, why kahuna, why land ownership, why is that something that you wanted to do, is that I love Sefer Vayikra. I think it is the best of all the Sfarim, which is partially like, I think, a funny thing to say, but partially because I think it tells us in a really deep way what it means to be in relationship to God in a way that God wants. Sometimes I daven or I do my Maaseh Kesafim and I'm like giving my little money to tzedakah and I'm like, okay, but this is an idea that people had. I know what God wants of me, and it's to be living in that place over there, farming the land, doing this with my crops with like incredible precision, and I'm going to try my best to get back there, and I'm going to try my best to kind of recreate that or use a substitute or do something totally different, but like think about it, in the way that it's either the Mishnah or the Rambam, I can't remember. There's this idea that like when you have kavanah, when you daven, you have to picture yourself in the temple, right? Like it doesn't exist. I can't go there, but I've got to imagine it. That is the way often that I think about kahuna. Sorry, just jostled my table there. So that is a part of it. And I think zooming in a little bit, I'm not going to be talking explicitly about gender in this, but I want you to kind of have that as a background lens. So we're about to see that Kohanim have a lot of, and Levium to a lesser extent, have a lot of kind of funky stuff about land ownership and the kinds of things they can do and the places they can go and like the way that their body looks, the clothes that they wear, the way that their hair is done, and so on and so forth, and the whole disability piece. Again, I'm not going to touch this explicitly, but like in the back of my mind when I was putting this together, I was like, oh, another class of people who have all these restrictions placed on the things they can own and the ways they can do business and the whole rest of their lives in a way more than like your baseline restrictions of being a free adult Jewish man. There is, I can't remember who does this now, but there's some Jewish queer theorist who talks about kohanim as like wives of God. So that is like a background idea that I think would be really interesting to bring in. I'm going to go straight in. I'm going to start sharing my screen, but I hope that was useful framing. If anyone has any questions, I want you to kind of shout straight out. As far as I know, I'm not going to be able to see you once I start sharing my screen. But yeah, literally just unmute yourself and call out. And Noah, you said you'll be kind of raising things from the Facebook comments. Incredible. Okay. So here's my background on Kahuna. This I didn't know until like quite late in my religious journey. And I remember I was visiting a friend at college, and kind of as a joke, it like came time to bench and they were like, oh, so-and-so, would you like to bench since you're a kohen? And the kind of person gave this like put upon sigh and was like, no, I would not like to do that. And they were okay, bimchilat kohen, like with the forgiveness of the kohen, someone else is going to do it. And I came away and I was like, oh, you have eternal dibs. You're always going to be first. They were like, what a fun idea. And the next time this parsha came around, I saw this pasuk. I'm going to read it. V'kidashto ki et lechem Elohecha hu makriv, kodesh yeh lach, ki kadosh ani Adonai mekadishchem. You're going to treat them as holy, v'kidashto. You're going to treat him as holy. So this pasuk is about a kohen, and it comes right before it is some kind of marriage restrictions, and right after it, I think, is the laws about his body. So the commentary, I'm going to take us straight to the Gemara on this, says, what does it mean, v'kidashto? How can I do that? What is the action of kiddush? And it says, okay, he goes first. L'chol davar shebiktusha, every kind of holy thing, liftoach rishon, ulevarech rishon, v'litol mana yafeh rishon. So he's going to kind of open first, which we think probably means where there's a list of speakers, I want him to be able to go first and to like make a bracha first. So that probably means hamotzi or benching, as I saw, and to have the nicest portion first. So like at dinner, he is going to get the nicest bit of dinner. He is going to get served first. So this is a class of people with basically eternal dibs. From so far what I've learned, what I was intending to accomplish with this was to kind of raise your hackles a bit, because my hackles are raised a bit. You know, I live in kind of a liberal democracy, I think, and the idea of like, oh, you're from this ethnicity or from this kind of bloodline, and so that means you always go first, carries this kind of intonation of superiority with it. It's a bit uncomfortable. And I think if I'd just seen this and you said, Isabel, tell me about kohanim, tell me about priests. All you know is they always go first, they get to kind of cut in line and they're first in the queue. I would say these are the most privileged people in society. They get the nicest things, they go to the nicest places, they trample on other people maybe. Like they have access to the best of everything from when they were born. You know, they've never gone to bed hungry, like that kind of thing. These are special people, these are the upper class. I don't know if that's where everyone else is feeling. And I do think it's interesting. Again, I'm not going to go into this, but I just wanted to flag it for you. That actually, I'm not, when I'm a kohen, at least as far as this Gemara goes, I'm not cutting in line at the shops. It's specifically for Dvarim Shebiktusha, and like all of these things have an element of holiness to them. So when I'm speaking first in the roster of people who are giving divrei Torah when I'm like a bracha is a bracha, that is a holy act. And probably litol mana yafeh rishon, mana yafeh, to take the nicest portion is probably about truma, or maybe it means when I'm at a Yom Tov meal, but it seems clear that the Gemara thinks that's a sacred act, like that's in conversation with Kedusha. Okay, are they the upper class? Unclear. I want us to park that for a moment because I want to bring us into a little bit of background on the way that people ate and the way that their money goes. And as an intertext for this, I want us to be thinking about taxes and how that works. So there's a series of different frames we can think about for the Kohen and again, to an extent, for the Levi. To some extent, there are dependents. They're the people that we support in the same way as I might be working and sending money back home for my little cousins or my aged grandparents, or like someone who cannot work and needs support. A little bit, they're the people who collect my tax, they're the tax man, and I don't feel in that power relationship to them where I'm like, I'm better than you and I give money to you because I can do this and you can't, or like I have this responsibility because of my higher power. Like that's one frame, but it might also be like, I'm a citizen, I pay my tax to a faceless entity or to like a guy that I really hate, and sometimes he defrauds me and sometimes he builds a nice road, right? So it might be coming from this power differential of I'm higher in power than you because I pay you money. It might be I'm lower in power than you because you're extracting my money. Or it might be neutral. It might just be like, this is what I do, this is what everyone else does, I don't really care about it. All of those frames, we're going to park them for a moment. So I've got a couple of chunks of Devarim to share. Again, we're thinking about how the society is set up. We're thinking about flows of wealth. Lo yaya lakohanim halvim kol shevet Levi chelek v'nachala in Israel ishei Adonai v'nachalato yochelum. The Levitical priests is how I think JPS translates this. It means all of the Levium, including the Kohanim here, because it says Kol Shevet Levi afterwards. They're not going to have any chelek or any nachala with the Jews, comma, they eat the fire offerings of God. And they eat the kind of nachala of God. At the moment, in the chunk of text, it is not entirely clear what that means. So nachala is a word of kind of inheritance and a chelek is a portion. And as we read on, or like from context, which I have stripped away from this text in the interest of the source sheet, we're kind of thinking about the apportioning of the land of Israel. So if you think back to anything you know about that, maybe you have one of the fancy Tanakhs with a little fold-out map and it says Manasseh goes here, Reuben goes here. Everyone else is going to get this ancestral land, and the Kol Shevet Levi are not going to have that. What they're going to have instead is the ability to eat the fire offerings of God, and that will be their nachala. Right now, that feels really scary to me. If you offer me a piece of land, which is always going to produce, I'm going to own it. If I want to farm it, great. If I want to build a bathhouse, great. Like, I have the power in that situation. Or you say, you're going to be able to eat 12% of the meat that comes to the temple and some grain and some oil. I think that is a worse deal. As in, I'll refine that, I'll nuance that a little bit. I think from the point of view of economic stability and a feeling of security in the things that I own, that would scare me a lot more. Spiritually, obviously, much better. Or you could argue that, again, sorry, I'll nuance that a lot more. I've been born and raised in progressive Bate Midrash, so I'm incapable of saying anything without nuance. Yeah, I think I'll stick with what I said earlier. With a view to economic security and stability and a sense of ownership, that is something that ordinary Israelim can have, and it is not something that Kohanim can have, and not something that Leviim can have. It is also quite isolating. So I'm going to read the next pasuk. V'nachala lo yeh lo b'kerev echav, Adonai hu nachalato ka'asher diber lo. The Levi is not a part of society, right? He is not going to have this nachala, this ancestral land, b'kerev echav. He's not going to be with his brothers, with his kin. Actually, it is his brothers because women are also kind of not part of this system. Or kind of, women don't have access to a piece of land that they can inherit and then pass on to their children without recourse to like an attached male's rights. That's how I'll say it. So the Kohen and the Levi and the woman are outside of this system. They're not going to have a portion in the midst of their brothers, which emotionally also sounds quite hard. And I think is going to do a bit more, if I had to take a wild guess, to promote the Kohen and the Levi as being these, I don't know them, I don't see them every day on the street. And so maybe I feel like I resent them a bit more. And maybe that pushes me a little bit more into the land of I'm paying tax to a faceless entity if I'm not living with them. I don't think I brought you the text here about the Arei Miklat, the cities of refuge where the Leviim are going to live. They do end up kind of getting places to inherit, so it's a little bit more complicated than what I'm showing you right now. The Kohanim, that's not true. They don't live in the cities of refuge. But again, the Leviim only get cities. You can't farm anything significant if you're a subsistence farmer with whatever it is, Bronze Age technology. You are not going to be able to live off what you're producing on your roof garden or like in your courtyard. That's not going to happen. Yes. So I don't have this stability. I can't keep going back to my piece of land. I have to depend on things other people bring to the temple as a Kohen or a Levi. And I'm going to be separate from my brothers. The next pasuk. וזה יהיה משפט הכהנים מאת העם, מאת זבחי הזבח, עם שור, עם שא, ונתן לכהן הזרוע והלחיים והקיבה. These are the specific bits of the animal that I'm going to get. Let's see if I can remember. If it is an ox or a sheep, I'm going to give the shoulder and the cheeks and the stomach. I don't know enough about butchery to know if these are the best parts or the worst parts. I'm going to name that. I've been a vegan for just over 7 years now, so this is like not my wheelhouse as much as I love Sefer Vayikra. Those are the bits of meat that I get. Great. What about the grain? Reishit degancha tiroshcha v'yitzharecha v'reishit geiz tzoncha titein lo. Okay, so for the vegans among the Kohanim, I'm getting the first fruits of the grain and the wine and the oil and the first shearing of the sheep. So I also want to pick up on the fact that with the meat, it's a set amount or like a set section. And here, at least for the JPS translation, and also the text because it says Reshit, we've got this idea of firstness again. So for me, that's bringing back up the idea that the Kohen gets to first crack at benching. At Birkat Hamazon, for example, that language in the Gemara of Liftoch Rishon Ulevarech Rishon V'Litol Manayafa Rishon. The kind of thing about him is that he gets to go first. That is his thing. So why aren't I, as the Kohen or the Levi, allowed that economic stability? Kivo bachar Adonai Elohecha mikol shvatecha la'amod l'sharet b'shem Adonai u'uvanav kol hayamim. God chose me as the Kohen. I can't be a subsistence farmer. That's not what God wants for me. I can't have the stability of having 3 years of grain in my storehouse. I can't have the knowledge that I'm consuming the fruit of my own labor. I'm a bystander in that whole system. And the image this almost creates for me is that the rest of society is kind of rushing onwards and the kohen is standing still. There are these agricultural rhythms of the sheep shearing season and the planting season and the first harvest and the last harvest, and they're going to pass me by. I'm going to exist as a spectator, and I'm going to know when they are by other people bringing me Reshit Geis Zonchem, their first sheep shearing, and that's how I'm going to know. And one of the many reasons that I wanted to connect the Kohanim and the Leviim to this idea of poverty is that same idea of being on the outside. Like what I told you about a moment ago, they're on the outside looking in, they don't know about the agricultural rhythms, they're just existing off other people's handouts. I want you to kind of take that image, and like, to me, it brings up in A Christmas Carol, Tiny Tim with his nose pressed up against the glass, kind of looking at these fatted geese. I don't know if that's a normal image. In the UK, at least, it's a classic, although I went to a Jewish day school and they would teach us all kinds of other things in the literature classes, but they had a ban on A Christmas Carol. Tiny Tim is like a street urchin and he's very poor, and he like begs Scrooge for some money. It's up. We don't need to go into the plot of A Christmas Carol. That's not where I'm planning to take this. But it brings up this idea of someone who can't get something, kind of up against the wall, watching it, wanting it, maybe eventually receiving it, but not from the place that it comes from, right? They're going to receive it as charity, as a gift from someone, and not through harvesting it themselves. Okay, lots of different images there. I'm just going to run quickly through them. So the Kohanim are separate. They're living off the first things belonging to other people, and they're living off these sections of the animals. And the reason for that is that they're chosen by God. So this has some kind of ritual significance. This might almost, I don't think it's a consolation prize because the order's clearly different. It's clearly that because they're very special to Hashem, that's why they don't have this land, which is difficult to conceptualize. And later in this year, I'm going to talk about why that might be God's vision for like the chosen amongst God's chosen. Like, clearly it's not by accident that Hashem wants the people who are most directly involved in daily serving them not to have this ancestral wealth. So we're going to come on to that. Right now, park it. This is a fantastic source. I'm bringing it here because I think it shows the idea of poverty among these chosen people like even more sharply than the previous source. The previous source, I was kind of trying my hardest to induce you to feel pity for the Kohen. I was like, he's having such a hard time, he doesn't have any land, blah, 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 blah. I'm not going to need to do that here because the words do it for you. Yeah, we're okay for time. V'halevi asher b'sharecha lo ta'azvenu ki ein lo chelek v'nachal ha'imach. Do not forsake him. He has no things. He doesn't have land. He doesn't have a portion. It's your role as a Yisrael not to forsake him and to kind of support him in some way. Miktzei shalosh shanim totzi et kol ma'asar tuatcha b'shana hahi v'hinachta b'sharecha. This is, so Marcel works on this 7-year cycle. I hope I'm going to get this right. 2 years out of the 3, my Marcel Shani goes to a Levi, and the 3rd year it goes to a poor person. Yes? No. Sorry, it's been a long time since I've done this. This tithe, normally I'm going to take it to Jerusalem, In the 3rd year and in the 6th year, it goes to a Levi and a poor person, right? They are the same, or not the same category, but they have the same rights and they have the same support structures set up to kind of to support them and to sustain them. And if I'd read the very next pasuk instead of just opening my mouth, I would have known that. Uva halevi ki ein lo chelek v'nachala imach, v'hager v'hayatom v'ha'almana asher b'sharecha, v'achlu v'saveu, למען יברכך אדוני אלוהיך בכל מעשה ידיך אשר תעשה. Right, the Levi is going to come because they don't have any portion. And who else is going to come with them? Who's the other kind of person who doesn't have ancestral land? Hager, so either the resident alien or the convert, depending on how you want to read it. Vahayatom, and the fatherless child who may have a portion but probably doesn't have the physical power to kind of farm and harvest it. Vaha'almana, and the woman who has no means of producing because she's not attached to an adult man. This is the company that God thinks of the Levi as keeping. I don't want to hammer this point home too hard, but this, every time I think about this, this shocks me, right? You told me about a Levi, I know what a Levi does. A Levi washes the hands of the kohenim in shul when they duchen. A Levi in the temple is like the musician for God. And also the Levi is in the breadline with the childless person and with the person who has no land and with the woman who has no one else. I think is an incredibly counterintuitive way to set up a society, to make your most exalted also your most needy.
If I could jump in with one thought I was having, when I think about people being fed first in a Jewish sense, I actually don't think about people. I think about how we're supposed to feed our animals before we sit down to eat. So I was like thinking about that in the sense that it reflects that the animals they're providing value to us, so we also have to take care of them because we have inhibited their ability to eat in their natural way, just go run about and take food from whatever they would take it from. And that to me kind of connects with like acknowledging like I might not see the work that Tribe of Levi are doing for us, but now looking at this source, I'm wondering like what is the work that the widow and the orphan are doing for us, and if the transitive property can move that far religiously, which I think it can, but something I'm thinking about now.
I think that is a fascinating question. I hadn't considered a kind of labor-informed lens on this, and I wonder how far I could take this reading that like I'm interested in the labor that the Levi is doing in the temple, or that he actually doesn't have that much labor outside the temple, other than kind of collecting Maaser Sheni. But the Kohen is a better example because he has kind of these roles of viewing people's nagayim, their kind of marks that might be leprosy on them or on their houses. And he has other jobs, but I forget them in the heat of the moment. So it might be compensation for ritual labor that maybe we don't think about so much. I think it's also, I think there's something there in terms of a statement being made about the value of people who aren't laboring either at all, or maybe they are, but not in a way legible to the majority of society. And like, if we try to kind of squeeze that into a modern day paradigm, it might be artists who kind of aren't creating something I can eat, or something that will make my commute 12% faster, right? They're not providing something directly to oil the wheels of my daily life. And also there is something there and it does provide value. And maybe even to take that up another notch, I'm thinking about my tax that I pay going to the government, who are then funding plays that I'm not going to see and funding museums and galleries that I'm not going to go to. So I feel I should clarify here. I like a museum, I like a gallery, I do go to them often, but there are lots and I can't see them all. Right, and I wonder if it's this idea that the things that the Levium do should be free at the point of use, which is language that in England, in the UK, we use to talk about our socialized healthcare a lot. It's not free, I pay for it during my taxes, but when I need it, it's free. So maybe I'm thinking about the same thing there, that I don't want to have to like, I don't want it to be the day that I wake up and I'm like, oh my God, I might have tzaraat, I might have leprosy. That shouldn't also be the day that I have to pay the kohen for his services. So maybe it's that, I don't know. There are some interesting texts about in what circumstances I'm able to pay a kohen for their services, and I can't remember them right now. Yeah, there's something really interesting about when I can pay also the person who looks at my bechor, my firstborn animal, to see if it's blemished enough that I can keep it or if I have to give it to the kohen. Share for another time. Okay, this is a diagram that I love, mostly because I didn't have to make it. It came from my friend and one of my chavrotas, Bizi Galinsky, just to kind of show you a visual breakdown of when I'm a farmer, like a Yisrael farmer who has no, I'm not a kohen, I'm not a Levi, I'm just on my land, how much of my food I actually get to keep. So I'm going to zoom in a bit because it's a little bit small. Oh, sorry. I'm harvesting 100% of my harvest. 2%, so 1 part in 50 goes to a kohen, that's Truma Gadola. Then I'm going to take 10% and that goes to a Levi, that's Maaser Rishon. Then a tenth of that, then a tenth of the Maaser Rishon, the Levi also gives to the kohen, which again is not the point of the shir, but I think it's very, very interesting that the Torah is invested in people who receive charity, also having to give charity. If you want to frame this as charity, or like who receive subsidies or who receive support or who are fed by the gifts of others, they still have to be involved in that economy of giving. Yeah, so I'm going to take 10% off again, and that is, depending on my point in the year cycle, Maaser Sheni or Maaser Ani, that's either going to go to poor people or the Levi, maybe also poor Levian, unclear. And this is a lovely breakdown of the final proportions. Okay, this is now making me a bit dizzy, so I'm going to zoom back out again. So I told you earlier, I was going to come back to why. Why would God make this class of people? God would say explicitly to us, I need you to set these people apart. I need you to treat them specially. I want you to support them. And then make them incapable of supporting themselves. What is it about the honor that God asks us to give to the kohen and to the Levi that means that they shouldn't be able to grow their own wheat and bake their own bread? Why do they need to be in this position of dependency? So I'm now going to kind of move away from explicit sources talking about the actual kohen and the actual Levi and into some broader sources about wealth and the difference between being provided for and being self-sufficient that I think are applicable here. This is from Masachet Yoma. So we're quoting a pasuk. God is the one who hama'achil chaman b'midbar lema'an anotcha. God fed you manna in the wilderness in order to afflict you. And the reason this comes up in Yoma is the kind of key word for the way that we fast on Yom Kippur is inui nefesh, like self-affliction. So the Gemara here is like, okay, where else is that used? What does it mean there? And we have this question of how can it be affliction if I'm getting free food, essentially? What about that is unpleasant? What about that is uncomfortable? Lots of answers. And if we were in a room, I would induce you to tell me what you think is going on here before I told you the answer from the Talmud. So I'm going to allow a moment for you to all think, I thought manna was delicious. What's the problem there? And now I'm going to give you Rabbi Ame and Rabbi Asi's answers. One of them says, Eino domeh misha yesh lo pat b'selo lemisha ein lo pat b'selo. This is the answer that's going to be more important for us, but I've given you both for completeness. V'chad amar eino domeh misha ro'eh v'ochel lemisha eino ro'eh v'ochel. So there's two answers. One is, it is not the same, the person who has bread in their basket and the person who doesn't have bread in their basket. And the second answer is, it's not the same, the person who can see what they're eating and the person who cannot see what they're eating. The background for these is, in the Gemara, they've just told me that manna can taste like anything you want, like apart from this select list of exceptions that maybe aren't so good for people breastfeeding, or there's something going on there. But I want it to taste like a chocolate fudge sundae, it's going to do that. I want it to taste like miso aubergine, it's going to do that. Miso eggplant, translated. But I'm going to miss out on the experience of looking at my food, and that's the affliction, which is like a fascinating kind of like a distinction that they're making. And I wish that every time I were afflicted, it were nothing worse than not being able to look at what I was eating. Although having said that, I've kind of read accounts by blind people where they say people who became blind later in life were like, I lost tons of weight because I didn't have the anticipatory experience of looking at what I eat. And I'll just kind of put my fork down and like whatever came back on it, I would eat that. But like, I wasn't able to separate out the parts of my meal. So again, interesting, not what we're talking about right now, but I want to go back to our first opinion. It's not the same, the person who has bread in their basket and the person who doesn't. And I'd suggest that the modern day equivalent here is like, who has a filled refrigerator, who has a well-stocked pantry or larder or cupboards. There's something fundamentally destabilizing about eating your dinner, eating your evening meal, eating your daily meal, and that being all of the food that you have. Even if you know that Almighty God is going to rain down manna on you tomorrow, even if you know for a certainty that more food is going to come, and maybe they didn't, you're still not going to have the experience that you would if you had leftovers, if you had something else to eat. And I want to suggest to you, I think this is a really useful tool for informing the experience of the kohen, who, when I'm a kohen, I'm receiving my food from the people who give it to me. And what that probably means is I might not have a storehouse full of wheat. So it's not quite the same because the manna kind of would evaporate on a daily basis, or after like, yeah, on a daily basis, unless it was Friday night. And there's no, well, so here's where there's a little bit of nuance. As a kohen, when I received truma, when I received that kind of 2% that we saw up here, or as a Levi, when I receive Maaser Rishon, that doesn't have an expiry date. I can keep that. So although I don't have a fridge, if it's dry grain, I can maybe keep that for a bit longer. I'm not going to be totally destitute tomorrow when I eat it today. But if we go back up to the, when people offer a sacrifice, I'm receiving the shoulder, the cheeks, and the stomach. Sacrifices have really strict laws about when you can and can't finish them. So if anyone's familiar with the custom at the Passover Seder that you have to be done by a certain time, that is kind of a remembrance of that. You can't keep eating kind of past halachic midnight. So we kind of are hearing echoes of the idea of this man and this I'm being fed on a daily basis because I finish my food on a daily basis. That is kind of coming through with the way that sacrifices work. A sacrifice which has got too old is called pigul, and it is a big deal to eat it. You would get karet, I think, which is not ideal. Okay, so that is the first way to think about the way that God envisions the Kohen and the Levi existing. It's inui, it's torture, it's affliction, right? Like it's a callback to this earlier time in Jewish history that was bad. We're going to And then the next source is, okay, leman anatcha, why would God do that to us? What is the advantage? Because God is God. God could do one big manna every year. So I want to read you why God didn't do one big manna every year. שאלו תלמידיו את רבי שמעון בן יוחאי, מפני מה לא ירד להם לישראל מן פעם אחת בשנה? They said the same question, why isn't there one big man every year? To Rashbi, and he said, I'm going to kind of make you a parable. What's this like? It's like a monarch who had one child. So this monarch kind of set out like sustenance for their child once a year, and then the child didn't see their father their parent more than once a year. Like, this story wants me to think there's a really tight link between being sustained by someone else and being in relationship with them, right? I don't want to see you unless I need something, or I'm not going to have access to you unless I need something. Amad ufasak mazonotav b'chol yom. So the monarch kind of changed the way they've been doing things and set out the child's sustenance daily. Sorted. Then the monarch saw their child every single day. So in case you haven't kind of got that metaphor, Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai kind of lays it out very clearly. Af Yisrael, it's the same for the Jewish people. Mi sheyesh lo arba'a v'chamisha banim, someone who has 4 or 5 kids, haya do'eg v'omer, shema lo yered man l'machar, is kind of anxious and says, maybe no manna is going to fall tomorrow. V'nimtzau kulan meitzim barav, and then we will all die of starvation. Which sounds like an overreaction, but probably wasn't, because in the desert, there's not much other food. That is what I hear about the desert. It turns out that everyone is inclining their hearts to their heavenly parents. This idea of being dependent on someone else makes you more aware of them, more in relationship with them. This might be what God wants with the Kohanim. I told you earlier, I said he has no nachala with his people, or they have no nachala with their people. And that must be really isolating, right? The image is kind of in an ivory tower, especially for the Kohen who I mentioned a little bit has these ritual roles of looking at people's nagaim and kind of seeing if they're leprosy or not. It could be really easy for me as a Kohen to think that I'm above the rest of the Jews. I get to go to these bits of the temple and you don't. I'm more tahor than you. I get all of these things. And it might be an attempt to counteract that, and an attempt to say, you can't feel superior when they are where your next meal is coming from. And the Havdil bit is something that people sometimes say to public employees. Not a very polite thing to say to public employees in this country, but they say, my taxes pay your salary, meaning you should feel more in relationship to me, more subservient to me, which is like an inappropriate thing to say, especially to teachers and nurses, but is an attempt to redress a perceived power balance, right? Although you have power over me in the lens of you can educate my children, or you can, like a traffic warden, you can tell me where I can and cannot park. You're a police person, you can tell me what I can and cannot do. You need to feel accountable to me because I pay your salary, because I'm where your next meal is coming from. In some ways, this can be a bit of a blunt tool for relationship building. I don't know that I would recommend it necessarily, but I think if I were trying to read this really sympathetically, I would compare it to eating with people. Like that is it's almost the inverse of all of the aspects of kashrut that are there to separate us from non-Jews. Because eating with people is what community is, right? Like that is where the English word companion comes from, is the person that you eat bread with, from the Latin pan. That's my little fun fact. Okay, that is one reading. This is a long and fascinating sugya. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I think there's a great metaphor in the middle. This is now not even about material dependency so much as just like money is evil. It is a really anti-money source. So it's from Brachot 32, and I'm bringing kind of lots of different examples, but the place that this is coming from is the golden calf. And there's this idea that Moshe is complaining to God and saying, you did it, or less complaining and more kind of bargaining, right? You can't blame them for this, you set them up to fail. And there's quite an intense example here coming from Rabbi Chia bar Abba. So he says, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Mashal, this is a parable, La'adam echad shehaya lo bein. This is like a person who had a child, and he washed that child, son, the gender is actually as important here. He washed his son and he anointed his son, and he gave him to eat, and he gave him to drink. And he hung this kind of purse around his neck, like a money bag. And he put him at the doorway of sex workers. How is that? What is that son going to do and not sin? So there's a lot to be said here about kind of rabbinic understanding of sex workers, like as representative of ultimate sin, which feels uncomfortable and often misogynist. But I think it's interesting that that's what Rabbi Chia bar Abba says, that Rabbi Yochanan says about money, right? In the way that you, God, gave the Jewish people money, you set them up to fail. There was nothing good they could do with that. In the same way as like, you are not expecting that son outside the brothel to kind of keep on walking and go and give all the money to tzedakah. Like, there's nothing good that can come out of having all this money. So my first text of like, why would God make the Kohanim and the Leviim so poor is coming from a place of, so they can be in relationship with the Jews, so they can be in relationship with God. And this text is like, if possible, even more of a blunt instrument. And it's like, because having stuff is bad. You shouldn't be wealthy. It's not a good idea. Nothing good is going to happen about it. So kind of in the surrounding sugya, there's like a lot of, there's a different mashal with a cow, and there's a lot of other psukim about being rich and also like well provided for. So like this idea of Sava comes up later, and Vayishman, like, so Sava is satiation, and Vayishman is like to become fat. Yishur and Vayivat, and then he kicked. Like, it might be that having the money is what's corrosive to me spiritually, and it might actually be being full and not being needy anymore. Okay. So I'm going to run through what we've done so far very quickly, and in my last 10 minutes, as I told you, Sefer Vayikra is my favorite book of the Tanakh, I think. So I want to show you kind of a few more ideas that have flowed out of there and into the Gemara around the idea of kahuna and wealth, which I hope will tie everything together nicely. But if not, know that I tried. Okay. We talked about Kohanim and Leviim not having their own land and having to live off the contributions of others. We thought maybe it's something to do with immediacy. If I have to eat every day, I'm not ever rich, I'm just getting by. And that might be to make me in relationship with the Jews, the rest of the Jews, and feeling accountable to them. And it might make me just avoid having money, which would make me a worse person. Something I didn't find a source for, by the way, but I just think is interesting is like, maybe it was just intended to free me from labor, right? Like having a farm is great when it means I can have wealth, but equally being a subsistence farmer is not a great lifestyle. And the history of civilization is like, to some extent, people trying to stop being subsistence farmers by any means possible. So like the very simplest answer, rendering my whole share null and void, might just be they needed time to do other things, and God wanted to make sure that they had that time and they had that energy and they weren't like in the field all daylight hours. So that's also possible. But I've given you all of these texts about how Kohanim are poor, Leviim are poor. They don't have the ability to keep some of their food for a long time, like the meat, the kind of finest and highest calorie and most nourishing food that they had. They can't keep it for a long time, and they're not going to have storehouses that are full year on year because they're getting kind of 10% of other people's stuff. And now I want to bring you, I'm going to kind of go back on myself once again. So I keep flip-flopping. They're rich, they're poor, they get first in line, but they don't have any land, and like, oh, but that means they don't have to farm, but oh, you know, they have to throw away all of their meat sandwiches in 2 days' time. All of this. And this final collection of sources doesn't inhere in the person of the Kohen or the Levi, it inheres in the place. So this, I'm now not going to tell you a story about what I as a Kohen can do. I'm telling you a story about the Mikdash. So this principle crops up in a few places. I haven't brought you all of them because some of them were boring. Not that the Torah could ever be boring. And the principle is this: Ein aniyut bimkom ashirut. There's no poverty in a place of wealth. So in Masachet Shabbat, I'm thinking about building, and I'm thinking, what is the smallest amount of building that I would do and then be chayav for breaking Shabbat or chayavet? And I give the example of making legs for a little stove so I can put a little pot on it. And because I'm in Shabbat and I want to match every malacha to something that someone would have done in the Mishkan, I say, this is about mavashel samanin litzba yiriot shechasra malachtan. I'm going to put the legs on the little stove so I can make a little bit of dye so I can finish off like the little bit of the curtains, right? I don't need a whole curtain worth of dye because otherwise I need a bigger pot and then my amount for breaking Shabbat would be bigger, it would be a whole thing. I just need a little bit of dye for a little bit of curtain. And that is rejected. Rav Acha bar Yaakov Amar, Ein aniyot bimkom ashirut. I'm not going to be doing a little bit at a time in the tabernacle. I'm going to get the most expensive dyes I can. I'm going to get scarlet and purple and blue. I'm going to cook them exclusively in enormous quantities. So your kind of William Davidson explanation here says they had no use for small crucibles, right? This is not a people who are doing things little by little. Here's another in Talmud which says, oh, when I have a lamb to sacrifice in the morning because it is the morning and that's what I do, that lamb is going to drink out of a golden cup because I'm in the temple. And it comes in a list of other exaggerations. And then they say, no, this one is literal. The other one's finer exaggerations, but like, no, the lamb actually drank out of an actual golden cup. And I think this is my last source. And I think about this really like a lot. It is about under what circumstances I'm allowed to wash the priestly vestments. And this is a Yesh Omrim, so this isn't a like for sure it happened, but I think it's fascinating. Ein mechabsinotan kol ikar, she'ein aniyot bimkom ashirut. I'm never ever washing the priestly vestments because there's no poverty in a place of richness. And like what that probably means and what Rashi says that means is when they get dirty, I throw them away and I just make new ones. Again, like most expensive dyes in the world, even the undyed stuff is pure white, which is kind of expensive to get and also the temple is almost characterized by smoke and blood and animal fat like going everywhere, and oil and wine. Like, it is not a clean place. It is not a great place to be wearing white. And they've said, yeah, that is by design. Like, I want you to have the experience as a kohen who's going into work. You don't have any ancestral land, you don't have any money, you don't really know what your next meal is or where it's going to come from, except that like it's not going to be provided by you, so you know it will be part of the Talmud. You come into work, you put on your clothes, you get a small spatter of blood on your left sleeve, and like the whole thing goes in the bin. I think it must be vertiginous, right? I think it must make you dizzy to go from experience to experience like that. If I had to hazard a guess as to what that was doing for me psychologically as a kohen, I think it's about who this is all for. The Mishkan isn't about me. I serve in it. It's not even a place where I serve my community. It's a place almost exclusively where I serve God. And that means it is the finest building on the face of the earth. I wear the finest clothes, I do the finest things. I look around me and all I can see is kind of marble and gold. And I think that contrast is deliberate. I can be rich or I can be poor in my own life, but I'm never going to reach the point of not being able to do laundry and of having my animals drink out of gold. So this is something that my thinking is still evolving on. So I'm not going to kind of wrap up and say, that's the answer. But I think these are useful lenses to go through. And moving on from this year, I think what I'm going to be thinking about, and what I'd encourage you all to be thinking about as well, is who has the power in the interactions that we have in our ritual lives, and who has the responsibility, who supports who, and who's respected. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. We do have a number of questions and comments from Facebook, so I'm going to start with a few.
Oh, amazing. Sorry, I would have given time for questions. Sorry, everyone.
No, I can batch it, but there are a couple that to me speak to similar things. Ozzy mentioned near the beginning, wives of God sounds Christian, like a nun. I would say that perhaps nuns sound priestly, but and he also says, you know, with much privilege comes much responsibility. Most people want the privilege without the responsibility. Therefore, a need for a draft where God drafts the tribe of Levi. So those to me both speak of the idea of election. In other religious traditions, joining the priesthood or a religious sisterhood is something that an individual chooses for himself or herself. Whereas here, like, you can argue that in the Torah, there was a moment of election when the tribe of Levi said, yes, we will do what God wants us to do. Interesting context compared to what they wind up doing in the temple and in modern day. But that obviously gets passed down from father to son continuously. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts about the way that relates specifically to the idea of poverty in the priesthood, that there was this election at one point in time, but now it's inherited.
So that is a great question. I don't know if this directly answers it, but it brings up a thread that I didn't quite have time to work into this year, which is the Torah, or the Mishnah at least, thinks that there were kohanim before there was kahuna, so to speak. There were people who were doing this service role before it was inherited, and those people were firstborns. And firstborns in inheritance law in the Torah get double the inheritance of other people in terms of land. And it's the moment that makes the switch from the firstborn boy of every family does labor in the Mishkan into it is exclusively people from Shevet Levi, is at the golden calf, which we just saw is kind of tied up with all of these ideas of wealth and sin and like inheritance and gold. And I'm wondering now, kind of, if it's all related, and if the golden calf is kind of a moment of rejecting, like both riches and also the rich. I don't know where to fit in the piece about personal choice, but I agree it's really interesting.
Ozzy also made several points that get to both the reality that there were a variety of jobs available to Kohanim and the wider tribe of Levi, but he does acknowledge that like the ideal is they're supposed to be serving God. He mentioned that folks who weren't Kohanim in particular, but just from the tribe of Levi, they were more spread out, so they would serve as teachers. But I would point to, now we have congregational rabbis. They still are set apart in a certain way. They might have a congregation where the majority of members are working 9 to 5, which is the American equivalent of being a subsistence farmer in the Torah. But they work on Shabbat, which is not normal for anyone else in Shabbat observant community. So again, like they're still socially set apart in a certain way, even if they are mingled among different cities. And there's also, the issue even with land being consecrated to the temple. Someone has to work it. But again, it's very different. They are set outside of the bulk of the economy there. But he again makes questions about what is the relationship between wealth and the temple, because we see bad, corrupt priests who accumulate wealth, but we also see good priests who have a wealthy temple. And I think it might be too obvious, but the idea of a wealthy temple as opposed to a wealthy priest, there might be something there within that, the collective temple being wealthy. Because again, like speaking of exaggeration, there are a lot of passages about just how gilded the temple was and weighed down with golden grapevines and all sorts of decoration. But yeah, I think that that's a fascinating idea, the difference between the wealth of the temple, the wealth of the priesthood, and the wealth of an individual priest. And yeah, oh, gosh, I'm sure we could go on and on forever. I will give a couple more moments if anyone here would like to unmute for a question or raise your hand if you need assistance with that, or type something out real quick. But this has been lovely. And I will mention that our next class at Drisha is right after this, more or less, starting at 1 p.m. Eastern. We are continuing Midrash on the Parsha with Rabbi Dr. Samuel Labens. It has been wonderful. It's always great to get into Midrash and to have more to dig into with the weekly Torah portion in general and create a richer picture. So, okay, with that, thank you so much, Ms. Bard, for this fascinating shiur and for staying in touch as an alumna and representing Drisha out in the wild, out in the world. And thank you to everyone participating in our learning community, your questions, your comments, your thought. It all really makes the experience what it is, because that's what it is. It is a collective Torah. And we look forward to learning with you all again very soon.